The problems of knowing what is the subject of the state of war, etc., are exactly of the same type as the problem of knowing what is the subject of perception. One will not clear up the philosophy of history except by working out the problem of perception. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, The Visible and the Invisible. So in 2014, there was an exponential sort of lift or tidal wave of immigration into the European Union. There were migrants coming from North Africa and from places like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Middle East. And they were landing on more than 1 million souls in 2014 were landing on the shores of Europe, coming across by sea. Very dangerous way to cross into Europe, obviously. And they were stationed all across Europe in these makeshift camps. This is Moria refugee camp in Lesbos in the Aegean Sea in Greece. And I chose at that point, I discovered a certain kind of optical technology, a camera. And this is it here. This is the PDF, sales PDF. And this camera is was made by a military weapons company, a multinational weapons company in Europe, and is sold almost exclusively to militaries and police forces. So its purpose is very specific. It's not a tool of storytelling. It's not a tool for professional photographers. It's a tool for police forces and militaries. And its primary purpose, its intention is insurgent detection, tracking, and targeting as part of weapon systems. So it's regarded as a weapon. Long-range border enforcement and search and rescue as part of the military humanitarian complex, which is Europe's response to the refugee crisis, as I understand it. So instead of adhering to the ratified treaties of asylum that were put in place in the early 50s after the Second World War, Europe has instead emphasized technologies such as this to keep these people out and to enforce its borders. And this is simply one facet of a much more complex totality of technologies and policies that constitutes Europe's response to the refugee crisis and to keep the people away from Europe, a sort of fortress Europe mentality. So, of course, I was intrigued by it, as any photographer would be, to understand it as a medium. I'm very interested in photography as a medium, and I'm a bit of a geek in that respect. And so when I discovered the camera, I started to inquire what its potentials, what powers are, what it can do. And I found that it can do quite sinister things. And so according to these tests by the manufacturer, it can detect human body heat, there's a human, bottom right, from 30.3 kilometers day or night, which is 18 miles. Yeah. So if you're driving a vehicle, a car, you can be detected by the camera that I used from 50 kilometers away, day or night. So your heat signature, your trace of heat, will be detectable to somebody operating that camera. So I thought, wow, Jesus, we're all doomed. So I tried my best to get my hands on the camera, and it turns out it's semi-classified. There's aspects of the camera that I was not allowed to access, and that was mainly in the user interface in terms of tracking. So those are the aspects of the technology which are used in missiles and that kind of thing. But I was able to purchase the camera as a citizen of Europe, an Irish citizen, which I did. And then it was very difficult for me to travel with the camera because it's what's called dual use, export controlled. So you can use it within Ireland or wherever in Ireland freely. But once you travel outside the EU, you need special export papers. And if you don't get those papers from the government, you can be arrested for weapons smuggling, which is a very serious offence. So it's this is a very protected technology. The camera itself is sanctioned in 12 countries across the world, including Libya and Syria. So these are two very important pieces of the puzzle of the story that I wish to tell. And what was the story? The story was, of course, the refugee crisis. I wanted to turn the camera against itself and to try to use it to reveal the struggle of the refugees, which is a very sort of almost perverse gesture, since the camera itself was designed to keep the people away from Europe. So this is in Melbourne. This is an installation I did. That's Moria Camp again. And so for the heat maps, this is framed photographs. There are 4 of them on view upstairs. I constructed those by mounting the camera on a robotic motion controlled tripod to create a thermal panorama of a wider angle of view. And this is how, in sort of time lapse, how the camera would operate on an X and Y axis, panning and tilting across the refugee camp thus. And so here we find refugees in the camp of Idomeni in this case, hanging out. And so then I would take each, it sort of rests to dissipate the vibration of the image, of the camera, sorry. I would take the still frames and then when I composite them in Photoshop thus. This is a camp on the island of Samos in Aegean Sea, and that it's constituted of 400 individual cells, or discrete frames, which have then been photoshopped together. That's what it looks like kind of in real time. Now, I made 28 of these heat maps and made a book called The Castle, published by Mac. But I also made, just to talk about that, I find, as an artist, I find a happy sort of accident when I made these works. I found that there's a sort of strange, uncanny resemblance to late medieval and medieval urban drawings, etchings, such as the Nuremberg Chronicle. This way of recording lived environment at that time, this is prior to the rules of Western, of sort of linear perspective of the Renaissance. It was very extraordinary representation of perspective, which I felt was sort of very resonant, similar to the, just go back there, to the heat maps. And the reason for this, I believe, is each of these 16 cells here has its own vanishing point, if you can imagine. And the final heat map is comprised of many, many more cells than that. And so if you are on a facing hill over this camp, this is Moria again, and you cobble together this panoramic image composited of these discrete cells, each with their own vanishing point. Then you have at least 400, sometimes more, vanishing points that have been sort of stitched together in Photoshop to create a very strange new kind of perspective, which is certainly not linear perspective. And in some cases, it does look surprisingly like this kind of form of representation. And also, I found a very strange correlation with Giovanni di Paolo, who's a late medieval painter. And in this painting particularly, we can see what I'm talking about. St. John the Baptist goes into the wilderness. And I think they call this in our history continuous time narrative in a painting. So paintings to us, there's a subject and he's walking. And you wouldn't have him walking twice in the same painting, would you? Because that would be strange, there'd be 2 of them. But back then, they had a different understanding of time within the picture plane. And so this is John the Baptist leaving. Actually, don't know where he's leaving. Some castle, but probably Jerusalem, eh? And he's going up into the mountains. And there he is twice in the same picture. So this is a description of his journey. And I found this oddly echoed in the heat maps here, because every time that camera moves within the picture plane, remember, there's sometimes a doubling of the figure of the refugee, as we find here. The guy in the hoodie, he's walking as the camera is panning, and he's captured twice. And often refugees are, for example, these Afghan boys playing cricket in a gas station in Serbia. They've been truncated by the camera because they're moving, whereas the camera's moving, and so they become truncated. And for me, this is an expression of the limbo state of the refugee, of the existence that they're forced to live in the asylum system in Europe when they arrive, when they're unable to move, unable to work, and really unable to know the future, what tomorrow holds. They don't know how long the asylum process can last, and sometimes it can last for years. And so I kept these digital artifacts, these glitches, into the images. And often it's not just refugees, it's also vehicles and animals. And so here we are. This is Idomeni again. I think that's upstairs. Moving swiftly on. You can see how the camera is calibrated to represent a certain wavelength of heat. And when it's too hot, for example, the fire, or the tent there is too warm, the camera, it distorts, it overexposes into this weird dazzling distortion, resulting in a kind of almost etched, very strange effect. So I made those heat maps, and then I decided to make to return to working with my good friends and collaborators, cinematographer Trevor Tweet and composer Ben Frost, to make an ambitious, immersive, multi-channel video artwork with the same camera. And there is the camera again, this time mounted on a Steadicam, which you can see that Trevor is wearing on the left. And Ben, who is a composer and a well-known musician, he is carrying a microphone, as you can see. And this is in the Jungle refugee camp in Calais in France. So we work together. Here's Trevor operating the Steadicam there, which is really an extraordinary thing that he's taught himself to do, because that's a very heavy camera. And these Steadicams, they really aren't designed to carry such a load successfully. So we had to go back a little bit in the history of cinema and find the Steadicams, the sort of better versions of the Steadicams from the 80s and 90s, which could take a better load, and he had to trim it so that it was perfectly balanced and learn how to carry it. And usually I would follow him with the Xbox controller, sort of at a low level, looking at the screen, which was at a low level for a reason, trying to do the zoom and the focus and other controls. So we were a strange combo. He was walking around looking like RoboCop, and I was like a little rat running along behind him. So as I said, now we're going to watch 52 minutes of Incoming, and these initial scenes are really, it's a non-linear piece. It doesn't have a start or an end, but this is really, for me, where the piece starts. It doesn't really matter. You can come in at any point. But these scenes were shot over the city of Gaziantep, which is on the southern Turkish border with Syria. It's a city where many Islamic State cells live and operate. And really what we're trying to do at this point, this is the dawn, is to sort of confront the viewer or show the viewer how the camera sees. And we're looking into the sort of negative space of the sky, the distortion of the blue sky. It can't manage to articulate that. So it's this beautiful raddled effect in the black areas there. And to create a kind of abstraction, sort of to clean the viewer's palette. If you've watched, there's a sort of a narrative arc, a non-linear narrative arc throughout the piece. But at this point, we really want to reset that viewer, that arc and the viewer's expectations, I guess, and to allow them to a bit of space to breathe before the piece begins in earnest. Now, Gaziantep is at this point one of the sort of gate cities from Syria. A lot of Syrian refugees would be living there at this point, and still are. They're unable to work, living in great desolation. Turkey is one of the nations which has a very authoritarian system of refugee camps, because they have so many, and they're quite well run. Although the future of these refugees is quite depressing. So. Moving to Kilis. Kilis is a city even further south, right on the border. A very, very dangerous town in terms of the Islamic State presence and other elements. We were working there, trying to be as covert as possible, because the Turkish police weren't into what we were doing. Also, we were very vulnerable to. We had a very desirable weapons technology with us, so we would have been vulnerable to Islamic State or other elements. So. When we were working on the border, we were trying to film what was happening inside Syria. We could see a lot of smoke, but we couldn't really see anything, the human eye. And I saw a glint in the sky, and I said, Trevor, I think there's a drone there. So he's like, where? We literally couldn't see it. So I got the camera and I pointed it right at this glint, and this is what the camera's actually showing us, is that searching process. And then Trevor finds it, we zoom in. It's actually an A-10 assault aircraft, which is the US Air Force, probably a naval, I really don't know, but it's an American assault aircraft which has an enormous gun which shoots 11-inch rounds. I think there's 800 per second. So it's now strafing Islamic State positions. So that's shooting a lot of these 11-inch rounds at Islamic State targets in a village just across the border. This was about 15 kilometers away. So we really couldn't see any of this with the human eye, but this camera is designed to do exactly this. It's designed for battlefield situational awareness. So you can see all of these armaments. These are rockets, and the camera can see the incandescence in every bullet and every rocket, and it's easy to see them. So this is really about establishing, well, first, of course, the cause of the Exodus, but also the rules of the reasons of sort of purpose, to show the viewer the purpose of why the camera was made, show it what it was designed to do. And in my opinion, it's shocking how well it was able to show us things that we couldn't see with human eye. And then we move, in this episode here, we've moved on. Now we're off the coast of Libya. If you remember, we couldn't go into Libya because it's a sanctioned nation, and we had to treat those laws with great respect. So we embedded with the Italian Guardia di Finanza, who are customs and border police. They have some fancy boats off in Sicily, in Messina, and other port cities that try to patrol off the Libyan waters to try to catch migrants and to rescue them, essentially, because it's extremely dangerous. So Libya is another of the routes that we intercepted. We intercepted 2 routes into Europe. One was from the south, from across the Sahara Desert, from countries from as far west as Senegal, Mali, Niger, across through Central Africa to the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Eritrea. These people would come through Sahara to Libya. They would usually work for a year, and then when they had enough money, they would get on these boats. And it literally is like a cat and mouse with the Coast Guard in the Mediterranean. And very few of these boats would make it on their own to Europe because it's such a long way, and the boats were so vulnerable. So yeah, it was at a certain point from 2014 to 16, it was just countless numbers of these boats, these very vulnerable people, and many of them died, as I'm sure you're aware. These ones, this boat here in the middle is a Croatian Navy boat, and they're being picked up off this rescue boat. That's a Syrian lady, and she's being rescued. And on the right now we have, obviously on the left we have some rescued refugees there waiting, a child being lifted up the same steps. To film this, we had a special maritime gyroscopic unit in an inflatable dinghy, which was extremely difficult to use. But as a result, we were able to get these very intimate moments, gestures of the rescue. And you can see here these rescue workers on the left are wearing hazmat suits because they regard the refugees as being diseased. And often, I'm afraid they are. They're often for weeks at sea. Some of them catch diseases. We met one refugee who's a Syrian dentist, actually, and he told us the story. He spoke English. He told us the story. They were at sea for 12 days, and one of the women was pregnant, and she gave birth on the boat. And he was the only one with any medical training, and they didn't even have Tylenol or anything. All they had was a bit of olive oil, and he successfully birthed that child on the boat in very cramped conditions. So now we've moved, the 2 screens on the right have moved into a different theatre of war operations, shall we say. We're now on board USS Theodore Roosevelt, which is a forward deployed aircraft carrier, bombing. It's deployed off the coast of Iran and Iraq, in the Persian Gulf, and it's bombing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at this point, Islamic State targets in Syria and Iraq, and creating obviously collateral damage with civilians as well. So this thing in the middle is a kind of a catch rope to catch F-18 aircraft as they land, so they don't fall off the deck on the other side. It's a very violent place in terms of physics. The deck itself is 65 Celsius, 150 degrees Fahrenheit. It's in the Persian Gulf summer, reflecting this black metal deck, reflecting all that heat. It's a very hostile environment for any living person or even camera technology. There were many of the Navy hands would collapse of heat dehydration during each day. There's that catch rope again, and it was about 90% humidity, so a very difficult place to work. You can see that sweat literally articulated on the skin here. That's what the camera really does to the human figure. It sort of doesn't represent the individual. It represents this this the organic biological trace, the essence of our bodies, really. This perspiration, the respiration, the flow of blood beneath the skin. All of that stuff is really brilliantly articulated by the camera, and almost to the point of turning the individual almost into a kind of zombie monster, which is a disturbing aspect of the way it represents the individual. So this is the camera and what the camera does. We're letting the camera speak. The camera is mediating what we see. The camera becomes an author on some level. And this is very much our intention, is to reveal that to the viewer and to sort of place the viewer into an ambiguous space. Here we're not representing refugees, we're representing the service men and women on the aircraft carrier who are carrying out, loading these missiles. This is a surveillance aircraft in the middle, and that's I think some sort of Sidewinder missile on the wing there. Actually, that's a classified technology. We were asked not to film that, but I was the decoy duck with the normal camera being, oh really? Oh, I'll delete that. Meanwhile, Trevor was getting all the good stuff. So this is F-18, the Afterburner, I guess, or the Jet Blast, and that strange Donald Judd-like angular piece of metal is a Jet Blast deflector to try to deflect some of the heat off the deck. It's extremely hot at this point and extremely loud. Ben Frost was with us recording, and he literally had to turn away from the sound and to huddle and protect the microphone from the sound, and even then it was just a total distortion mess, which of course Ben really likes because that's him. And so there's something almost weird about this, where these people are almost praying to this strange evil war god. So this is going through the paces before takeoff. If we'd like to turn the sound up. So you might have seen a little green glitch there, and that's a glitch created because of all the heat and humidity. There were several glitches that occurred on board that boat because of the vibrations and the heat and the hostile environment. Of course, we chose to keep all that in because we're very interested in a very truthful portrayal of the camera and how it responds to its environment. So none of this was, I mean, we graded it slightly, but we really couldn't grade it very much. And when I say grading, I mean affect the levels and contrast of the video image, because the camera bakes a ProRes video file into an SSD chip, and that's that. There's no raw file like there's not much you can do with that video file. So what you see is what you get, really. And we didn't colorize it. We could have turned this any kind of color, but we chose to just leave it exactly as it comes out of the camera, more or less. So this scene is, we've just been on a carrier showing the cause, and so now we're moving to the effect. The cause, of course, is the bombings, the war, the conflict in the Middle East. And this scene is another sort of refresh scene. Actually, when you see it projected very large in the space, often people feel nauseous. That's because they feel like those waves, sort of all-encompassing waves, it tend to make people dizzy. So the idea was to make the viewer feel like they're drowning, like they're at sea. This fella here on the left, he's a volunteer working with a volunteer organization. Typically tend to be Coast Guards, but also other people who've taken time off work, European people, sometimes Middle Eastern people, who've taken time off work to help out, in this case on the island of Lesbos, but they were all across the Aegean at this time, and they were basically trying to save people's lives. Some of them were absolute heroes, in my opinion. However, what they were doing was illegal, so they were breaking the law because they were seen a according to the European Union immigration law, they were seen as assisting human traffickers. And some of them were arrested and put in prison. And I'm going to step away and let you listen to this for a sec.
Do we have one?
No, we have mayo tube. Let's do the breathing as we learned, okay? So two
Oh, it's okay.
breathings.
The head is okay.
So on October the 28th, 2015, we were filming. We'd been filming for quite a long time, and we recorded, documented, and witnessed one of the worst human trafficking disasters in recent memory, on the Aegean Sea at least. So it was a ship with 300 people, more than 300 people, had been overloaded. It was a fishing trawler, a hard trawler. It was an old one, and these very unscrupulous traffickers just loaded it to the brim with refugees and sent it into very choppy water. It was quite a stormy day. And unfortunately, the top deck was so loaded with people, human cargo, that it collapsed onto the lower deck, injuring and actually killing people. And in the ensuing panic, the entire hull ripped apart. And so all those 300 people who survived the initial collapse were forced to, the boat sank, were forced into the waves. And so here we have, it took hours for the rescue to occur. It was a real mess. The first boat on the scene was a Frontex boat, but they were completely unequipped for rescuing people. They were merely there to surveil. So it was actually down to these volunteers, but also the local fishermen and the Hellenic Coast Guard to try to rescue people. And it took 4 hours or more to rescue whoever was still there. And you can see on the left, you can see this is a hypothermic victim. This is literally outside on the pier of Mollyvoss. And you can see sometimes the skin, you can't really see at the moment because they're swaddled. They've swaddled the person, but the skin is white compared to the rescue worker whose skin is black, and that's because the rescue worker is warm, and the hypothermic victim is so cold he looks like marble. And so you can see that they're trying to rub human life, human warmth, back into the hypothermic refugee. And you can see the handprints there. The camera is showing you exactly. This is a very adequate technology for this particular scene. It's showing you exactly what's going on in terms of trying to save this individual. And it's doing that in the middle of the night. So it's also doing it from quite a respectful range, so we're not intruding. And yes, so we recorded many similar sorts of landings, as you can see on the right here. And there were plenty of press working around us as well. As you can see on the far right, there's lots of snappers. So this is a very tender portrait of a young Syrian lady and her boyfriend or partner or husband who just landed on the shores of Europe, and this sense of uncertainty and relief flashing across her face. And really, she's relieved, of course, to have landed, to survive the crossing, but her real journey has just begun. So an image like this is extraordinary, and I've never seen portraiture like this. And we're shooting, because it's a very super telescopic field of view. It's very hard to create a traditional image with foreground, medium ground, and distance background, because we're looking through a telescope, literally. So Trevor has very artfully tried to construct a more complex image by shooting through weeds like this, a slightly out of focus effect, creating a kind of tactility within the image. And so the visual language is such that it's much more compelling. But the image itself is, I think, unique because it's such a tender portrait, and it's also invasive on some level, because we're shooting. She's not really aware that we're there. There were a lot of photographers around in this particular beach, but she didn't know she was being filmed. Yet the camera doesn't identify her. So this is a slightly interesting thing that occurs, is the camera anonymizes the individual. Although it feels invasive, and can be used in invasive ways. Actually, in this case, it's protecting that individual's identity. And many refugees, because they're regarded as doing something illegal, crossing illegally, even though they have human rights of the refugee behind them in international refugee law, they're still breaking the law according to host nations. And so many of them wish to remain anonymous. And so as any photographer who's tried to photograph the refugee crisis will tell you, this is the real dilemma. Do you protect their identity and simply turn the camera off and walk away and not tell the story? Or do you take the picture, risk identifying them to the immigration authorities and tell the story? And this camera allowed us to do that, to tell the story in an I hope a more adequate way, but without violating anyone's wish to remain anonymous, which is really important thing, because consent, of course, is very important when you're dealing with very vulnerable individuals, stateless people. They have human rights, but those human rights have been massively eroded in Western societies, and they're not being upheld. They can be preyed upon not only by human traffickers, but all kinds of other people, such as sex traffickers and human slavers. And not only that, but the EU immigration officials will find any reason to send them back and to deport them. And one of the reasons is something called the Dublin Convention. It's a law of EU immigration policy whereby if, for example, these refugees make it to Germany and they apply for asylum in Germany, if the German immigration officials can find documentary evidence of them landing in a different EU nation, such as a photograph of them landing in Greece, which is this, and they can prove that that's them in the picture, then they're forced to go back to Greece where they landed, the first port of call. It's a very screwed up law in my opinion, because it puts all of the stress on southern European nations such as Italy and Greece, turns them into massive refugee camps. And of course it was written by northern European countries to keep their populations nice and pure and to keep the burden from their economies. There's many reports that have proven that actually refugees do not represent a burden on economies. They're a source of cheaper labour for jobs that most of us citizens would not be willing to do, and they've actually strengthened economies. So a country such as Germany, which has Angela Merkel was quite wise in accepting a huge wave of refugees in 2014-15, and it's done wonders in the German economy, whereas other countries have been very unwelcoming, such as Britain and Ireland, I must say. We've done our best. So here on the right is actually a very interesting image, because this is the crime of human trafficking being filmed at 3 or 4 in the morning, dead of night. You could see the refugees running en masse across the top of the image, and maybe you can't, but there are little black dots up there on the top there, and they're being herded by human traffickers down the hills. There's actually another, just right of the center of that image of that screen on the right, you can see a cluster of black dots. That's a cluster of refugees waiting, and that ship in the foreground is the Turkish Coast Guard trying to catch them in the act. And so we're filming this whole infrastructure of human trafficking from another continent, from Greece, from Europe, and it's happening in the hills of Ayvalık in Turkey, Turkish coast. So there's something extraordinary about that, the power of the camera to reveal. Now the film is full. It's almost like a catalogue of these technologies. This is a Romanian Frontex helicopter here. It's buzzing us. It's very curious what we're up to. And you see that's the thermal camera. And it's not the only one in the film. There's plenty of them, especially on the aircraft carrier. And so you really must understand these technologies as a very inherent part of Europe's policy, of the future, of the surveillance of all of us. If we allow the violation of the human rights of the refugee, then ultimately we will potentially be next, as we're all potential refugees. These are very important laws for us to uphold, and we seem to be not really caring at the moment. And so what's happening is our liberal democracies are sliding towards authoritarianism. It's not just in this country, it's also all across Europe, especially in countries such as Hungary, Poland, Italy a little bit, potentially other nations. Croatia has a bad policy too. And so what you find is the refugee elicits this crisis. It's the sort of the thing that these populist politicians use, the figure that they cling to in order to prove certain ideas and to create a state of exception, in other words, a state of emergency, to withhold the human rights of all of us. And so once you have this state of emergency in place, our human rights no longer have this hold up in court in the same way. And they also use this to change the nature of the judicial system, such as happened in Poland and Hungary. Hungary really has lost its checks and balances on its government at the moment in the last few years because of how the dictator there, I would call him that, the leader there has totally changed the nature of the democracy that constitutes their government, and he's done that through the politics of fear of the refugee. This is a kind of alarmist sort of xenophobia that he's used as a tool to seize power and to strengthen power and to make himself unassailable. And we're seeing this not just in Hungary, also in other places. So these scenes. Sorry, I was taking a tangent there, but these scenes show the sort of scale of what's going on here at this time. And this is the Mytilene, which is the capital city of the small island of Lesbos. It's just rows and rows and rows of refugees, and some living in tents along the port, and these massive ships ferrying the refugees to Athens. And this is the scale of what we were seeing at that time, and it's shocking, you know. I think it's very important for us to have record of this for the future. The sheer numbers. It evokes some of the imagery. Evokes Second World War. You know, this guy with the shades earlier, he's a policeman, and he's lining up refugees who are squatting in lines. And it somehow evokes the concentration camp or prisoners of war, which indeed they are. And so this scene is a very troubling scene. This is disturbing imagery, but a very important aspect of the journey of this entire story is the identification of those who've died along the way. So this scene was shot in a pathologist's surgery mortuary in a hospital in Rhodes, the island of Rhodes in the Aegean Sea in Greece, and they found bodies who've drowned at sea, and they were at sea for about a month. We don't really know, until they washed up. So their bodies were so decomposed and that when they were recovered, it was impossible to identify them. And so they put them into refrigeration tanks until they had a chance to try to identify them scientifically in this way. And so that's what we're filming here. And we got access because we met the pathologist. We said to him, we're artists. We've got this piece we're making about the refugee crisis. We've been working for this many years. Can we film what you're doing to try to identify these people? And he's like, absolutely. So he let us record an autopsy sequence. It's a little bit disturbing for some people to see, and it's certainly disturbing if you're in the room. It was not just the smell, but the sight of these corpses was almost something you couldn't look at. You have to, if you weren't a professional, look away. But mediated by the camera, actually, in my opinion, it's these scenes are much more, I'm not going to say the word palatable, but much more communicable. They're much more neutral. I mean, this little girl, she was 11, and the fish eat the softest muscles first, and so they'd eaten all the scalp and the tendons in the face, but the rest of her body was like a kind of rotten cheese, whereas this shows it very scientifically what's occurring, and what we're seeing here is the extraction of DNA, and this is a really crucial aspect of what's going on here, because we have a lot of people, when they arrive in Europe, go missing. Families are separated, and some of them have died, and their bodies are never found, or they're eventually washed up like this girl. And so it's extremely important to all people around the world, all families, that they can bury their loved ones and can know that their loved ones are dead. But particularly in certain Middle Eastern cultures, such as the Kurdish culture and Arab culture, it's absolutely important that the body is brought back to the homeland and buried there. And if that's not done, there's a real lack of closure. And so what this pathologist is doing is he's cutting into the femur bone of the little girl to chop out a section a few inches, and that will be sent to another lab, and they'll grind that up and extract the DNA. And the reason he's chosen the femur is because it's the best preserved part of the body at this point. Everything else is too rotten. And so what they do with the DNA when they extract it is they enter it into a computer database. And meanwhile, there are activists, volunteers out in, say, Syria, Kurdish Iraq, or wherever, going around to families who say they've lost relatives and never heard from them for months or years. And then they say, well, look, if you could just let me take a pinprick of blood from your finger like this and put it on this swab, we can try and do a computer match. So volunteers take this, just a drop of blood from families, surviving families. That's taken, put into the lab, the DNA is extracted, and that's put into the same database. And sometimes positive matches occur. And that's a real closure. Then that body will be sent back to the homeland, to the families to bury. And that's a really important element. And this pathologist was working for free. He's a Greek government paid pathologist. He would do this on the weekends. So there's many aspects of this story which are really heartbreaking and amazing. I'm not saying Europeans are terrible people. The governments have done terrible things and they need to change their policies. But some of the things the people who work for the government are extraordinary also. And there are many positive aspects to this story, such as here. This is actually Templehof Airport. If anybody has ever been to Berlin, they may have spent time in Tempelhofer Feld, which is a beautiful park, flat park. And Templehof Airport was built. There's a very interesting sort of layers of history to this building, because it was built in the early 1930s under the redevelopment of Albert Speer's redevelopment of Berlin to create Germania, which is the world city, the capital of the world, the new Nazi world they were building. And so this was their beautiful Nazi airport. And the building architecture is extremely fascist, as anyone who's been there will avow. And shortly after World War II, it was also the site of the Berlin airlift. So I don't know how good your European history is, but Berlin was under siege by the Soviet Union at that time, and so the Allies would fly supplies, coal in the winter and food all year long, sweets for kids. They would sometimes drop them or sometimes fly them into this airport. Usually C-47 Dakota aircraft. And so these planes would come en masse to relieve the citizens of Berlin. So that was a historic aspect of the Cold War. And then in 2007, the airport shut because they had far better airports in Berlin. Sorry, that's a joke. It's an insider joke. They have fucking terrible airports in Berlin. In 2007, they turned it into a park, and it's a wonderful civic space, and it really is a great place for people to run around, roller skate, and fly kites. But part of this building is the third biggest building in the world, after Erdogan's palace in Istanbul and Ceausescu's palace in Bucharest. This is the third. And you can see it from space, apparently. Of course, you can see anything from space these days. But so they've used part of the building as an emergency shelter for refugees. And so these individuals here are, most of them are still in the asylum process. They're still awaiting the verdict to come back, will they be deported or not. But to all extent and purposes, they're the lucky ones. They've made it to one of the best places for refugees in Europe. And Germany has, I think they give €400 a month to refugees for groceries and 500 allowance for rent. And so even when they can't find work, and I think for a certain amount of time they're not allowed to work actually, but even when they can't find it, they are able to live rather well, relatively speaking, and they can actually find their own apartments. But so this shelter is where these families who've just arrived are sent, and it's not a bad place to be. However, each of these cubicles that you can see here are, holds a couple of families at least. So there's very little privacy. And privacy is a very important thing to note in this case, because this is the only part of the film that we're filming in domestic space. So it's very important for us to get to, we'll go back to this idea of consent, for us to get consent from these individuals. In a public space where newsworthy things are occurring and unfolding, the laws say that it's okay to film. And obviously consent is still an issue to any photographer, but it's legal. Whereas if you go into a domestic space like this, you really must get consent. And so we worked with the camp authorities. We asked them, we explained what we're doing, what the camera, how it sees, why we're doing it. And we said the camera anonymizes individuals so they can't be identified, and would we have permission to film there? And they said, well, we think it's up to the refugees, so if you would like to put posters up around the place for a week before, explaining what you're doing and when you're doing it, and then we'll let you film from 11 a.m. till 2 p.m. on a certain day. And anyone who doesn't want to be filmed can leave during that time, go and spend time in the park or whatever. And we even put a little image of how the camera sees human figure, so that there was no confusion. And so these people, on some level, there was at least an attempt to get consent from each of them. This is a gymnasium, and we're filming volunteers doing circus tricks and teaching the kids. Kids are bored as hell, so doing little tricks like this. And while we were filming, this extraordinary thing happened. These two kids in the middle started to fight, as young boys do. And just before I talk about that, it's extraordinary. If you look at his the boy without the t-shirt, you could see he's just been exercising, so he's flushed with fresh. His arteries are up on the surface of his skin, so you can see the patches of heat created by his arteries and his blood circulation. Anyway, this fight became quite epic. Trevor, meanwhile, kept moving around the scene to create this texture, because we have no foreground. He's trying to make the image more dynamic by moving across the net like that in the foreground. And meanwhile, this fight continues, and there's something really, I suppose, symbolic for me in this scene, because, as I said, these kids have come all the way to here. They made it to safety. They should be, they should be healing. They've left their homes behind, but they're the lucky ones, But I suppose this scene speaks to me on a symbolic level of the trauma that will return throughout their lives. This sort of the trauma that emerges from the individual. In this case, perhaps this fight was a result of that. We don't know. It doesn't really matter. As an artist, we're taking it as a sort of a symbol of this recurring trauma in the life of the refugee, because the refugees have left home behind. And they've come to a new place which will never really be their home. So they're between. There's, in a way, they'll never really find home. In a way, that's a difficult place to exist in, space to exist in, and many of them will have very difficult memories of conflict and war from the before they left. So this scene, we literally walked out of that gymnasium, and as I said, the people fly kites over Templehof Airport, and there were people flying kites. And normally, any right-minded artist would never film kites. They certainly did. If they did, they would never admit they had. But I looked at Trevor and I said, "Trevor, what would Werner Herzog do?" And Trevor said he would film the kites. So we filmed fucking kites. And I think I'm really glad I did, because those kites on the right, they resemble F-114 stealth bombers to me. And the one on the left is very much about the human body. And this whole film is about the human body. So it's about the sort of somatic presence of the human and physically in space, the biological being that we exist in. And the camera's perfectly suited for revealing that and foregrounding that mortality. And then we've moved swiftly on to the jungle refugee camp in Calais. So we had this, I won't quite say utopic experience of the situation in Berlin, but it's very much a positive, hopeful place, relatively speaking. And then we moved to a camp in France, where we see their policies have created something close to hell. And I've visited the jungle so many times, countless times, probably about 10 times, trying to find a way to film it, and I always felt intimidated, or I always felt there wasn't really an opportunity. It was always very tense. I even witnessed people being robbed in front of me, and there were regular battles between. They had the Afghan village, and then they had the Syrian village, and other villages, the Somali village, and often the Afghans would attack the Syrian villages at night. And at one point, I remember at night time I went there, and there was a riot between the CRS, the riot police, and the refugees. They were hurling bricks at each other, and I just thought, okay, maybe I won't do this. Maybe I'll go back to the pub. But in November, I think it's late October or November. I mean, it's late October 2016. François Hollande, the president of France, was facing enormous criticism over Calais, over the jungle in Calais, which just grew and grew and grew into this city of tents, a huge city of tents, and so he decided in one fell swoop to dismantle it with the help of the CRS, the riot police, and the fire brigade of Pas de Calais, who are these guys in the middle and the right. And there was a 3-day event. I'm not sure who burned the camp, whether it was the fire brigade or whether it was the police or whether it was the refugees themselves in protest or the volunteers. And there was a whole infrastructure of volunteers, many of whom had come from Britain or all around Europe or from the Middle East, who come to live in the camp to help feed people and make sure everyone was cool. And they were great people too, but I get the feeling maybe they set the fires. maybe not. Certainly a lot of the caravans and tents and whatever were stacked together and then burned together, so possibly it was the police. But in any event, in any case, this event was an absolute spectacle, and the media descended en masse. There were hundreds of them, and I've always had a hard time getting access to the place to film in terms of permissions, but when I saw this was starting, I gave Trevor a call, and I'm like, dude, neither of us have the energy to do this, but I think we have to hop on a plane tonight. But I really don't want to, because we were really exhausted, we were really burned out, just constant flights here and there, and it was like a moment's notice, we talked about it for an hour actually over the phone, and then Trevor said something really profound. He quoted an ice hockey player. God knows who, maybe somebody here knows about ice hockey, but there's some famous ice hockey player famously said, "You miss every shot you don't take," or something to those. Maybe it's, "You miss every goal you don't shoot." I don't know. In any case, doesn't really matter. And once I heard him say that, I said, fuck, okay, I'm buying the flights. Get your passport. And so we went straight to the airport, and we went straight to Paris, and we went straight there. And in the meantime, I called Ben, and Ben came in 5 hours later, and we spent the next 3 days filming this event. And I'm very glad we did, because we had no problems with access, because there were so many photographers, and there was so much going on. Nobody checked for credentials or accreditation. So we were able to just run in and film, and because of all the fires, obviously there's something quite apocalyptic about it. It was quite dangerous work as well. Many of the kerosene stoves that are used for cooking and for keeping tents warm were exploding all around us. And these guys in the middle are the CRS riot police. They look quite sadistic, almost like RoboCop. Something strange about their carapace uniforms. Quite notorious. But this really, this is the era in which we live in. This is our world. This isn't the future. This is France, man. Now. And that's like something I struggle to believe, but I've seen it, and I'm trying to convey that to you. And it's sadly true. There's something like this sort of neo-fascist dystopia about it. they're putting refugees on buses and sending them to other parts of France. And there was some discussion with Britain. Britain might take some of the minors, so these minors were milling around. Minors being under 18-year-olds, usually boys, almost all boys. But they're all milling around in this weird conflagration. And then we were about to pack up and head for the airport, and we'd spoken to somebody, a British writer or something, and he knew about my work, and he ran over. He could see we were packing up. He's like, dude, you can't stop. There's something happening over here. And I was like, no, we have to get our flight. He's like, no, just missed the flight. So we're like, okay. So we ran over, and there was this extraordinary event was happening right at the end of this dismantling of the Calais jungle. And that was this Christian church it was its last service. And this is a church that was built provisionally out of pallets and whatever that people could find, tarpaulins and things, built by the mostly Eritrean, possibly also Ethiopian people, refugees this song is their last service. So there's the real sense of mournfulness, sadness. This is the church they built that's meant so much to them. You can see, by the way, you could just about see the sort of face print on the left on the cold metal gate of these two men who've pressed their hands and face against the cold metal gate, and the thermal print of their face and hands is left there, almost like the Shroud of Turin, if anybody knows it. These icons were handmade by the refugees. They're being brought out with great tenderness and love and being saved, because that church is about to be burned. And so I don't know where the icons ended up, but the spectacle of them removing them from the church was heartbreaking. And a scene like this is, I suppose, to me, it's pretty important, because a lot of people in Europe think refugees equals Islamic extremists, and I beg to differ. It doesn't always. In fact, it almost never does. Sometimes there are some lunatics. That scene on the right there, that, to me, it almost echoes the photograph of Iwo Jima from World War II. But Trevor didn't agree. He wanted to cut it out. And there's the Last Supper there on the left. Just stand back and let that play a little bit. So that's a pretty significant cut in this film. We go from Calais, the jungle, where they're putting some sort of lace onto the icon. We cut straight to the middle of the Sahara Desert, where a refugee in the middle of the night. Let me just give you a bit of context. So the safest way through the Sahara is a very dangerous place to travel at the moment, and it has been for a while, and that's because of all kinds of Islamist groups, including Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Islamic State. There's all kinds of other groups, just loads of bandits. And so Mali is a very dangerous country in its own right. You wouldn't want to go to the north. Some of the roads are just unpassable. The same goes with Chad. And to get to Libya and Algeria at that point, and probably still still not safe. I don't know if you read the paper, there's been some terrible things happening in Niger. But Niger is possibly the safest route to take. And so all of the refugees will find a way to get to Niger without going through these other countries. And they pass through Niamey, the capital, to try to get to Agadez. Agadez is a city in the north. It's maybe the last town on the road north. It's a similar city to Timbuktu. It's an ancient town. And then after that, the roads peter out into the pure desert, and to get to Libya from there is really rather dangerous for all the reasons I mentioned. There's also no roads, so you can get lost. So what happens is there's a burgeoning industry of human traffickers and many of whom have Toyota Hilux pickup trucks or bigger trucks like the one in the background. And they get their passengers, they're paying passengers, and then they, on a Sunday night, they all go en masse in an enormous convoy, and it just goes all night long. It's just these trucks leaving Agadez, and they go fast. Like once you hit the desert off road, they don't slow down, because the drivers are quite scared of being ambushed. And so they go as fast as they can, sometimes 60 miles an hour off road, which is really quite hairy, especially when you're hanging on the back without a seatbelt or anything. And they'll drive. It's a 4-day drive usually. Sometimes it's 6 if you're on a bigger truck. And there are stops along the way where these sort of transient, temporary sort of fueling, halting sites where people will stop to refuel and just keep going. And there's money changers who ply the crowd, and people can buy noodles and Fanta, whatever else, to get some food. And this fella in the middle, he took that time to pray. He's obviously a Muslim, and the Muslim tradition, they do something called the wudu before prayer. Wudu is where they wash their face in a ritualistic way in their hands, and so that's what he was doing, splashing the water on his face to wash himself. Actually, the Quran says if you can't find water, to use sand. And there's actually some refugees here. I'll try and point them out. You could see, there he is on the left. You see, that's sand. So he's done the wudu with sand before his prayers. And so really the scene for us was, this man faces extraordinary struggle, great uncertainty. He doesn't know what he will find when he gets to Libya. And we filmed him in the middle of the night, 4 a.m, in total darkness, and we were able to film the sort of release that prayer brought him, the extraordinary, I don't know what you call it, a kind of joy of just being present. I don't know what you'd call that, but there's some word for it. But in the midst of this chaos surrounding him, which we tried to convey through this distorted noise of generators and pop music and shouting and diesel engines, and there's still this humanity that is evident, written in his face, that we've captured, which was, I thought, quite special. And so then these people will proceed. They'll jump back on their trucks. And some of the trucks, as I said, are quite big, and they honestly look like a scene from Mad Max, the way they sail across the desert like this, off-road, en masse, these sort of convoys. There you see they're hanging off the back, and if they fall off, the driver doesn't stop to pick them up. And the IOM say that as many people die in crossing the Sahara as die on the Mediterranean. And we're talking about refugees. So there's a lot of people who die out there we just unaccounted for.